named the most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek magazine, and one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by Jerusalem Post. In addition, Rabbi Wolpe is a columnist for Times.com, has been published and profiled in New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, on Faith website, the Huffington Post, and the New York Jewish Week. He has been on television numerous times, including the Today Show, Face the Nation, ABC This Morning, and CBS. In addition, Rabbi Wolpe has been featured in series on PBS and A&E, the History Channel, and the Discovery Channel. Of course, there are numerous books that it's not on the list that Rabbi Wolpe has been the author of. So it is my pleasure and my honor to ask Rabbi Wolpe to come up and give us.
I'd like to start with my face. So some of you know this story because I told it at Lunch and Learn, and individually to some, but I want to tell you the fullest story, which so far I don't think anyone here knows. Saturday night I was at a wedding, and 5 minutes before the wedding was supposed to start, I was walking in the back of the Beverly Wilshire. It was dark. I didn't see the sound box. I tripped over it, and I fell flat on my face. When I got up, I saw that my face was literally pouring blood. So I said to the poor sound guy, who was Israeli, I said, go get me a napkin. So he came back with a paper napkin. I said, no, I need like napkins. Look at me. In the meantime, the pooling of the carpet on the Beverly Wilshire was not a pretty sight. Anyway, it was a Jewish wedding. So in about 5 minutes, there were 75 doctors surrounding me. No, 2 actually, but okay. And giving contrary advice. One said, take the handkerchief away. The other said, no, keep it there. Put pressure on it. Let me see it. Anyway. Fortunately, I didn't feel a concussion. I didn't have double vision. I didn't have a headache. And Cantor Feldman was, I just want to say, since he's actually here, he was phenomenal. He was the best possible partner. He ushered me out. He kept making sure I was okay, and I had an adequate supply of napkins. And literally, as I'm holding the napkin over my face and wiping away the blood, I do the wedding. So, well, I also, because knowing everybody would be nervous and not knowing what was going on, because I also had a huge red mark here and here, much worse than you see now. So I made a joke about it. It was Rana Hakimimi's wedding. I've known her for years, and I said, you know, I've seen many beautiful brides, but I never fell over, literally, when I saw one, until Rana, just so that people would laugh and they would know that I was actually okay and I had fallen. Fine. So then Cantor Feldman immediately, as soon as the wedding was over, he walked me outside, and we thought, I got to get to an ER, either to Cedars or UCLA, and I thought, I'm going to be there all night long, because really, you know, when people come in with their stab wounds and I say, well, my nose is bleeding, they're not going to say, oh, let's take the guy with the nosebleed. And then, dressed very elegantly in a gown and high-heeled shoes, comes Sheila Nazarian, who is a cosmetic surgeon. And she walks out in the alley where we are, and she says, you're not going to the ER. She said, you married me. I'm taking you to my office and taking care of you. Her husband, who is a neurologist, Fardad Mobin, brings the car around. I get into their car, trying very hard not to bleed on their nice car. And they drive me to the office where he does a neurological exam to make sure my brains are intact, while she sews me up. And I just thought, you know, I gotta say, if you're gonna get sick, Rabbi is the profession, because this was unbelievable treatment. Anyway, so they sewed me up, and then he literally took me to Rite Aid, where they said, you know, the drugs will take an hour, because when he was there and he was the doctor, he got them in 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. So they drove me back, and then I drove over to the Goldbahars where I was supposed to go to the bar mitzvah, and I said, listen, I can't. And they both gave me a hug and sent me home. So, here's what I wanted to say about it, though, other than telling you the story. Pesach is coming, and I had no matzah. So I thought I can do the rest of my Pesach shopping later, but I really like the whole wheat matzah, and it sells out quickly. So it's Sunday morning, the night after the debacle, and I thought to myself, I'm not going to go far. I'm just going to run over to Gelson's, which is like 2 minutes away. I'm going to get myself the whole wheat matzah, and I'm going home. But here's what struck me about it and why I'm telling you this story. It was the first time in my life that I remember that I was acutely conscious of the fact that I looked weird. Because believe me, if you think I look weird now, Sunday morning I was a mess, right? Didn't shower, threw on whatever I threw on. My face was like red and blotchy. I had a Band-Aid here. Some of you saw me Sunday night. I looked worse Sunday morning. I went to Gelson's and I watched how people looked at me. Most people didn't look at me. They just averted their eyes, right? Some people, like the lovely person who bagged the groceries, deliberately looked in my eyes, but you felt like she's deliberately looking in your eyes to show you that she knows you look weird, but she's going to look in your eyes anyway because she's a kind person. But even when but nobody looks at you normally when you look abnormal. Right? Nobody just glances at you and looks away the way we always do with each other all the time. So this morning, Cantor Feldman and I conducted a funeral for a man who was a track star and then was in a terrible accident and for the past 40 years lived as a quadriplegic. 40 years. So I got up and I said, look, you know, this is when I fell. And I told the story about going to the supermarket and how strange it felt to have people look at you that way. And I said, and that is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what Robert lived through his entire life. Every time someone saw him, the first thing they saw was here's a quadriplegic. And it took a long time to see past that to the person who he was. Okay? That's the story that all of you heard if you came to Lunch and Learn. But here's the end of the, at least the end so far of the story. So after Lunch and Learn, a woman whom I'd never seen there before came up to me and said, really enjoyed the class, but the first couple minutes were especially meaningful for me. I said, why? She said, because I have a 32-year-old son who, since he's been 2, has been quadriplegic. And I thought, the first of the 3 ways that I want to talk about the way Judaism helps the world is we teach our lessons. It's that simple. When something happens to you, the Jewish tradition tries to make meaning out of it. And when you do that, it is remarkable and astonishing and unpredictable who you touch along the way. If you had said to me, by the way, there's going to be somebody there who has a child who's a quadriplegic and this is going to mean something to them, I would have thought exactly what I thought when she said it, which is, this is unbelievable. But that's part of what Jewish teaching tries to do, is it tries to put the human experience in a context that can be meaningful and deep for all of us, no matter what that experience is, even if it is as unusual as walking into the supermarket with bandages and blood all over your face. That there's something in that that is supposed to teach you something. And that idea, what's called actually in literature omnisignificance, that everything means something. That doesn't mean that everything is intended. That I don't believe. I don't think everything is for a purpose. But everything can be used for a purpose. That I do believe. I don't think that God said, okay, Wolpe tripped. Right? But I do think that having tripped, and being as lucky as I was, that I could find something in it that was meaningful and important. And that's the first of the 3 things that I want to say, because so much of the Jewish tradition is about interpretation and commentary and stories and what we say about the stories. And we sometimes forget how deeply you can touch someone's life with these things. But it's very, very powerful, especially if what you have to say is something that they have gone through in their own lives. And that's just as an aside, I discovered this when my mother had a stroke when she was 52. She had a cerebral hemorrhage. Terrible, and is still alive, but has for years not been able really to speak, and has had all sorts of other problems as a result of it. But I realized that whenever something happens to you, doesn't matter what it is, you become part of the great tribe of pain. All of a sudden, people whom you know, but you don't know that this happened to them, come forward and say, oh, you know what, this happened to me. Do you know how many people have had facial injuries since I got this? Everybody I know. I was just talking to Michael. Michael told me the story of a dog bit him in the face. I didn't know that about him. But when something happens to someone, everybody comes forward and says, you know what, this happened to me. I learned today that Nahida had her nose broken 3 times, and she said it was no big deal. I don't believe her. I mean, I believe her about the 3, but I mean, seriously, but why? What brings that forth? What brings it forth is when you see a person suffering and you've experienced the same thing, you start to share what happened to you. And it also draws people closer together. So part of this is just very Pesach-like, which is we share our stories. That's what, I mean, after all, Haggadah means the telling. When you tell your story, other people know what it's like. I got my hair cut today. I walked in, but everyone already knew the story. Because Herschel Nagy gets his hair cut in the same place. And they said to me, oh, Herschel told us you fell down. What's that?
I waited on my haircut today.
You also got your hair cut. I know you did.
And I colored it too.
They told me, oh, Herschel already told us you fell down. So, but I mean, that's a wonderful thing. And that is part of the contribution that the Jewish people makes to the world, is that we tell each other our stories, and it's meaningful, and it's helpful, and it helps us all get through. So now I want to tell you the two principal ways that I think that Judaism is helpful to the world, apart from that first way. And in order to understand the first way, you have to remember the trajectory of the Bible. This is the way the Bible goes, okay? God comes to the world, God creates the world. And as soon as God creates the world, things start to go wrong. Right away. God puts Adam and Eve in the garden and says, don't do this one thing. You can do anything you want, just don't do this. They do it right away. They get kicked out of the garden. They have 2 kids, Cain and Abel. One kills the other. Then you have a succession of catastrophes leading to Noah's Ark, because God destroys the entire world and starts over again. And then God decides, okay, I'm going to try a different strategy. I obviously can't make the whole world good. So I'm going to try to take a representative people with Abraham and Sarah, and I'm going to teach them how to behave. And maybe if they behave well, the rest of the world will learn lessons from them. Right? That's the idea. When you say that Jews are a chosen people, what that means is they're supposed to be model students. That's really what chosenness is. Chosenness is, you guys have to do this so that people will see this, and maybe if you do it right, it'll catch on. Now, we know from the Bible that we did it wrong a lot. But God kept trying with us. Every time we did it wrong, God tried again, and again, and again. So that is part of the reason that Judaism is different from other traditions, because it's designed to be a small tradition. Judaism is not actually designed to be a large world religion. It never was. Because the idea is, here is this representative group, and other people don't have to believe what you believe, they don't have to do what you do, as long as they can see you and learn from you.
Don't touch it.
So that's why, in fact, the Jewish tradition has done this. So I remember growing up, my father telling me that he met with a Mexican priest, and he said to him, "Do you know what we envy you Jews? We envy you your institutions." He said, "The institutionalization of Jewish life is amazing, and we take it for granted. But do you realize how many schools and federations and synagogues and organizations? I mean, we have more organizations than we have Jews." We have so many, with all these different letters, and I'm always, if you look at my email box in the morning, so many Jewish organizations. Israel alone has so many organizations that do everything. And that idea is, if you model how to take care of one another, maybe other people will learn. And so sometimes we think that when Jews take care of Jews, it's insular. But the truth is that it's also part of our core mission, which is to say, look at how we take care of each other. You can do this too. And when I said at the very beginning about the doctors, and about how as soon as I was surrounded by all these people, that's very Jewish. You know this. Everybody in this congregation who goes through a tragedy talks about how people all gather around them. But one of the ways that Judaism is supposed to influence the world is by showing people how Jews treat Jews. Now, whether God anticipated this or not, I'm not sure. But you know, the same thing that people admire also sometimes causes envy and sometimes hatred. Because when people see that Jews care about Jews, they get upset. Sometimes they think it's wonderful, but sometimes they say, what, they only care about each other? And why don't they treat us the way they treat each other? Well, by the way, first of all, I hope you don't treat everybody the way you treat your family. You shouldn't, right? We all have circles of concern that are gradually widening. But the first responsibility of Jews as Jews is to care for Jews. And not to apologize for that, but to model it. Because if everybody in the world took care of their own people the way Jews take care of Jews, you wouldn't have Syria right now. You just wouldn't. That wouldn't happen if people took care of their own people the way Jews take care of Jews. Not that we've never fought with each other. We have, of course. But still, on balance, we've taken care of ourselves very well. And so, when we change the world, the first is the biblical strategy of modeling for the world how families should work. But you know, it's really important to remember and to remind ourselves that we do have a responsibility beyond the Jewish community. So, I think that which responsibility you emphasize depends on which community you're talking to. By that I mean, there are some Jews that only care about Jews. And those we have to remind about the responsibility of the world, and I'm coming to that in a second. Then we are afflicted with Jews who only care about the world and don't care about Jews. Right, if you ask yourself, for example, why is it that it's much easier to get Jewish donations for the Amundsen than it is for Sinai? The answer is very clear. It's uncomfortable, but it's clear. Because a lot of Jews care much more what non-Jews think about them than what Jews think about them. That's why. And the non-Jew will see your name at the Amundsen and think, ooh, look at that. They're not going to see your name at Sinai Temple. Or if they do, it's irrelevant because it's a temple. So for those people, you need to emphasize how important it is, the ingathering of Jews. But it is also true that we have a prophetic tradition, that we have an obligation to take care of the poor and the hungry, and those who are alone, and those who are bereaved. And you can't say, what do I care about them for? They're not mine. I don't know how many of you remember that powerful story, or if you were there, that Janice Kaminer-Resnick told about going to the Congo. And she was in a camp where women who had been unspeakably treated in war and by soldiers were being tended to medically and otherwise, and they had seen the worst imaginable things. And Janice, who grew up at the synagogue, we should be proud to say, has gone there many times. And she was in this tent where they were treating women. And one of them looked at her and said, "What are you doing here?" And she couldn't say, "I'm a Jew," because this woman has no idea what a Jew is. It wouldn't mean anything to her. So you know what she said? She said, "I'm a member of an ancient tribe. And my tribe teaches that every human being is in the image of God." Now, if that speaks to you, and if it doesn't, I can't imagine why not. But if that speaks to you, then you realize that that's also part of our tradition. That was a very Jewish thing to do, to treat this woman who has no connection to Judaism and never will. Never will. But she's a child of God. And that in fact, it's the same values that animates Jews to take care of one another that should push them also beyond their own community to take care of those who are least among us. It doesn't matter what your politics are. You have to care about people who are hungry and who are poor. You have to. It's a fundamental Jewish value. Just read the prophets. They're always yelling at Israel about taking care of the widow and the orphan and the hungry and the poor. You have to. And if you don't, then there's something deeply, deeply wrong with your Jewish orientation in this world. We were talking today about Pesach. It says, "All who are hungry, come and eat." And I said to the class, how many of us will have someone who's truly hungry at our Seder? And the answer is, none of us. None of us. So what do you do with that? Well, one thing you can do is you can give to organizations. Yes, you can. But the tradition knew from giving to organizations. That wasn't a strange thing to the Jewish tradition. We had a communal plate called a tamchui. It's mentioned in the Talmud. Every community is supposed to establish it, and it is the social welfare plate. And if you're poor, you're hungry, you go and you take from it. You don't know who put money in it. In other words, that idea exists in Judaism. But it doesn't say in the Haggadah, "Let all who are hungry go and take money from the communal plate." It says, "Come to our house," because our rabbis knew that the actual human encounter, face to face with someone who's poor or someone who's hungry, it changes you. You don't think about hungry people the same way if you know them. Just like you don't think about Jews the same way once you know them. We know this from human experience. To know someone is to change your view of them. And so we miss out by living in a bubble where all who are hungry don't come and eat. So for Pesach, to go and feed someone in a soup kitchen is exactly what the Jewish community mandates of us. In other words, to move out of our very confined world of privilege to people who are really hungry, who are really in need, or to travel and see need firsthand in places of the world where there's poverty that we, thank God, can't even imagine in this country. And to see that the people who are poor are people who are poor. And they're not essentially different from ourselves. And their hopes aren't essentially different. What's different is our obligation to them. So Judaism doesn't only teach us how to change the world by the way it teaches us to treat Jews. It also says that our obligation to the world is constant. Now, you will say, and you'll be right, it's too much. Far too much. You can hardly take care of your own neighborhood, much less the world. And that's where Rabbi Tarfon's famous phrase comes in. He says, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. You don't have to finish all of it. V'lo ata ben chorin livatel mimenu. But you're not allowed to stop trying. So yeah, you don't have to fix it all. But you have to do something. You have to be aware of the fact, which I will repeat here, even though every time I do, it makes me less and less liked, that rich people are less charitable than poor people. All across the board, in percentage of what they give away, in time they donate, they just are. Because wealth insulates you. The bigger the car you drive, the less likely you are to stop for a pedestrian. And it's not you individually, it's all of us. It's a condition of wealth. That's what wealth does. There literally was a group of wealthy people that wanted me to teach them once a month. I published this article in the LA Times, they called it off. Seriously. They called it off. No, we don't want to do it. Not after you publish that. Because I didn't say, oh, but Jews are much more charitable than everybody else. Because that wasn't the point. The point is to make wealthy people aware. They went into a school and they arbitrarily divided up the class. Half of them were now the rich people and half of them were the poor people, and they treated them that way for a day, and then at the end of the day they gave them empathy exams, and the rich scored lower than the poor. Because as soon as you feel insulated, it's a human reaction, we all do it. As soon as you feel insulated, you feel safe, and you don't want to interact. You don't want to see that face in Gelson's that doesn't look pretty. You don't. You don't have to live with it, so you don't. And we have systematically in our lives made everything that is uncomfortable disappear. Whether it's into a hospital room or into a neighborhood we never go into. And you know how you feel. I feel, we all feel. And believe me, I'm not absenting myself from this. When you're at a stop sign and someone pulls up in a ragged car, you get worried. So realize how insulated we are from the difficulties that other human beings have. And part of the Jewish tradition is, you're supposed to see yourself like, what if you were a slave? In other words, the poorest of the poorest of the poor. That's how you're supposed to see yourself, not because you are a slave, but because it will awaken in you the reality that what separates you from that is just a few lucky circumstances and a lot of hard work. But without the lucky circumstances, the hard work wouldn't matter. And so you still have a responsibility, and that is a fundamental Jewish teaching. It just is. So Judaism helps us by teaching us our stories, by telling us to take care of one another, and by awakening our empathy for those who are less fortunate than we are. You know, according to Maimonides, when you see a beggar, you're not allowed to ask what he's going to spend your money on. You're not allowed. You're not allowed to say, oh, he's probably going to get a drink. I'm not going to give it to him. Someone's in need, they're in need. It's their responsibility what they do with what you give them, but it's your responsibility to give. I don't know if you're aware of this. When you're poor and you get tzedakah, you know, the first thing you're supposed to do, find someone who's poorer than you and give it to them. And so it means, in part, overcoming the psychological block. Because really, most of our lack of tzedakah is a psychological block. It's not a financial block. If someone says to you, will you give 5, 10, or 15 of whatever, you pick the denomination. Whether it's $5, $10, or $15, or 5 million, 10 million, or 15 million, whatever it is, when someone asks you that, you and I both know that the decision you make is not actually a decision that's going to affect your life, it's a decision that's going to affect your mentality. How am I going to feel if I give this much, as opposed to giving that much? It's not like you're not going to go out to dinner tomorrow night because you gave that. Or you're not going to have food on the table, or you're not going to drive a nice car, because you will. And therefore, we have to rethink what the Jewish tradition asks of us about ourselves. And that's hard. And if it makes us uncomfortable, then good. That's where we are. That's who we are. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Judaism is not here to make our lives entirely comfortable. It's also here to challenge us and to push us. And if you want to hear how Judaism helps the world, one of the ways it does is by helping Jews be better. And that's one of the ways we help Jews be better, by helping those who are in trouble. And all those themes, all three of them, are wrapped up in Pesach, which is why this timing is so good. It's first of all, obviously, all about telling your story. As I said at the beginning, over and over and over again, Passover is the tale of tales. This is what happened to us. You should see yourself as if it happened to you. This rabbi tells it this way, and this rabbi tells it that way, and this rabbi insists that you do this about the story. But it's always about the story. The second part of it is that you're supposed to take care of Jews, because after all, that's the essence of the story. Is God leading the Jewish people out of Egypt, and Jews taking care of one another as they go through the desert. And then the third part is the universal part. Because I don't know if you're aware of this, I hope you are, but the story of the liberation from Egypt has been used in every generation by almost every group that has a liberation story to tell. There's a beautiful book by Michael Walzer, the political scientist, called Exodus and Liberation. Not a very long book. And in it, he traces the history of all these liberation movements up to the civil rights movement, liberation theology in Latin America, and guess what they all use as a paradigm? The Exodus. So that idea of inspiring the rest of the world to be free, that's also what we do. I'll close with this, and then I'm happy to take questions or comments about this. The last way that Judaism helps the world understand itself better and be better is the fact that at Passover, when we talk about this worldly liberation, we also talk about the Messianic age. And the idea of the Messiah, the idea that one day everything would be okay, that also is a gift that Judaism gave to the world. You know, in Greek society, the Golden Age was the age of the past. The gods lived in the past. Achilles lived in the past. The epics of Homer all in the past. But in Judaism, the Golden Age is in the future. Because nothing that happens in the Bible is going to be as wonderful, according to the rabbis, as the Messianic age. And so you always feel that there is a teleology of moving towards a goal. And that sense that it is possible that tomorrow will be better, and the day after that will be better, and the day after that will be better, that is also a crucial gift that the Jewish people gives to the world. That's why you end your Seder by saying next year's Seder will be better than this year's. That's what it means to say it's going to be in Jerusalem. And if you're in Jerusalem, you say in a rebuilt Jerusalem. In other words, in a world that is better than now. So there is always that expectation. But of course, the obligation to make the world better than now is ours. It's ours. Just as our ancestors made the world better than then, which is why we have the world of now. When my great-grandparents came to the United States, it wasn't so they could make a good living. It was so their children could. And their grandchildren better. And their great-grandchildren, they hoped, even better. So that sense of hope in the future, which is deeply rooted for the Jewish people, for our children, but also for the world, is part of